The summer of 2007 was supposed to be a fresh start for Maureen Brainard-Barnes. At 25, the Connecticut mother was struggling to make ends meet, working multiple jobs as a car dealer, telemarketer, and cashier, but nothing seemed enough to provide for her family the way she dreamed. That's when Maureen made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. Like thousands of other women across America, Maureen turned to sex work to survive. The internet had revolutionized this dangerous profession. No longer did women need to walk the streets, vulnerable to every passing car. Instead, they could advertise on Craigslist, screen potential clients, and maintain some illusion of control over their circumstances. But as Maureen would tragically discover, that control was nothing more than a deadly mirage. On July 6, 2007, Maureen's cell phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. It was a burner phone, untraceable and anonymous. Over the next 3 days, 16 calls would pass between Maureen's phone and this mysterious number. The caller was methodical, patient, building trust. He spoke softly, promised good money, and seemed different from her usual clients. Maureen had no way of knowing. She was speaking to a predator who had been perfecting his hunting technique for years. July 9th would be Maureen's last day on Earth. She was staying at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, far from her home in Norridge, Connecticut. The money was better in the city, and she could earn more in a single weekend than she might make in weeks at her legitimate jobs. That evening, she received the final call from her mysterious client. He was ready to meet, he said. He had cash in hand and a specific location in mind. Maureen called a friend before leaving the hotel, following the basic safety protocol that sex workers had developed in the digital age. She provided the friend with details about where she was going and when she expected to return. It was a precaution that might have saved her life in different circumstances, but against the predator she was about to encounter, no precaution would be enough. She stepped out of the Midtown Hotel into the humid July night and vanished forever. No surveillance camera captured her getting into a vehicle. No witness saw her final moments. Maureen Brainard-Barnes simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Days passed with no word from Maureen. Her family grew frantic with worry. Then, in a cruel twist that would become this killer's signature, Maureen's friend received a chilling phone call. A man's voice, calm and deliberate, claimed he had seen Maureen. She was at a house in Queens, he said. She was alive. The friend's heart raced with hope and relief. Finally, after days of terror and uncertainty, there was news. She begged for the address, promised to come immediately, asked what condition Maureen was in. The caller remained vague, but promised to call back with more specific information. He never did. That single call was designed not to help, but to torment. The man on the other end of the line knew exactly where Maureen was because he had put her there himself. 2 years passed. The investigation into Maureen's disappearance yielded nothing. Police treated it as just another case of a sex worker who had probably moved on to another city or met with some predictable misfortune. Her family continued to search, but the trail had gone completely cold. The killer, meanwhile, had been watching, learning, and preparing to strike again. In July 2009, another young woman would fall into his trap. Melissa Bartholomew was 22 years old. Originally from Buffalo, New York, like Maureen, she had come to New York City with dreams of a better life. Melissa wanted to be a hairdresser, imagining herself working in one of Manhattan's trendy salons. But the city was expensive and unforgiving to young women. Without connections or resources, Melissa initially worked what sex workers call the stroll, walking up and down the streets near strip clubs in Times Square, looking for customers. It was dangerous work, but she had protection. A man who worked with her would position himself across the street, watching for trouble, ready to intervene if a situation went bad. This arrangement provided some measure of security, but it also meant sharing her earnings. As Melissa became more experienced, she made the same calculation that had attracted Maureen to online advertising. She could cut out the middleman, keep all her money, and work from the relative safety of hotel rooms instead of street corners. She began posting ads on Craigslist, handling her own bookings and client screening. It seemed like a smart business decision. In reality, it was signing her own death warrant. On July 3, 2009, Melissa's phone rang with an offer too good to refuse. The caller wanted to pay her $1,000 for a single encounter. It was an enormous sum, far more than she typically earned. The caller sounded professional, polite, and legitimate. He knew exactly what to say to overcome any hesitation she might have had. Melissa accepted the booking and arranged to meet the client at a location he specified. She followed her usual safety protocols, informing others of her plans and expected return time. But like Maureen 2 years earlier, these precautions would prove useless against a killer who had studied the habits and vulnerabilities of his prey. After meeting the client on July 3rd, Melissa Bartholomew was never seen alive again. But this time, the killer made a critical error. Instead of discarding Melissa's phone immediately, he kept it as a trophy. This decision would provide investigators with their first real insight into the mind of the monster they were hunting. For weeks after Melissa's disappearance, her little sister Amanda received calls from Melissa's phone number. Each time the caller ID showed her sister's name, Amanda's heart would leap with hope. Perhaps Melissa was calling for help, or to explain where she had been. Instead, the voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man who took sadistic pleasure in describing, in graphic detail, exactly what he had done to Melissa. The caller's voice was calm, almost conversational. As he recounted acts of sexual violence and murder, he seemed to relish Amanda's horrified reactions, feeding off her pain and desperation. These weren't random prank calls or empty threats. The man knew details about Melissa that only her killer could know. He had intimate knowledge of her final hours, her suffering, and her death. The New York Police Department attempted to trace these calls, managing to track them to cell towers in Midtown Manhattan. But the conversations were always brief, ending before technicians could pinpoint an exact location. The killer was technologically sophisticated, understanding how to communicate just long enough to inflict maximum psychological damage while avoiding detection. After several weeks of tormenting Melissa's family, the calls stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The killer had grown bored with his psychological games, or perhaps he had found a new victim to occupy his attention. Amanda was left traumatized, haunted by the voice of her sister's murderer and the knowledge that justice seemed impossibly far away. The pattern was becoming clear, though law enforcement had not yet recognized it. The killer was targeting sex workers who advertised online. He was using burner phones to maintain anonymity. He was sophisticated enough to avoid leaving obvious evidence, but arrogant enough to engage in risky behavior like making taunting phone calls. Most importantly, he was not finished killing. In June 2010, 22-year-old Megan Waterman boarded a bus from her home in Maine to New York City. Megan was a young mother with a 3-year-old daughter at home. Like Maureen and Melissa before her, she had turned to sex work out of economic desperation. She was determined to provide her child with opportunities and stability that she herself had never experienced. Megan's brother Greg would later describe her as someone who cared too much, who carried the weight of responsibility for everyone around her. She had promised to give her daughter everything she couldn't have growing up, no matter what sacrifices that required. It was a noble goal that would lead her directly into the path of a predator. Megan typically worked weekends in New York, taking the bus down from Maine on Thursdays and returning home by Monday. This schedule allowed her to maintain some semblance of a normal life for her daughter, while earning the money they desperately needed. She was careful and professional in her work, building a steady clientele and developing safety protocols. On this particular trip in June 2010, Megan checked into a Holiday Inn Express in Hauppauge, Long Island. The location was about 50 miles east of Manhattan, far enough from the city to be affordable, but close enough to attract clients. She had no way of knowing that choosing Long Island as her base of operations would put her in the direct hunting territory of a serial killer. June 5, 2010, started as a routine day for Megan. She was settled in her hotel room, posting advertisements online and responding to inquiries from potential clients. Her phone rang at approximately 1:30 in the morning with what seemed like a standard booking request. The caller had gotten a burner phone that very day, activated specifically for this purpose. He was methodical in his preparations and patient in his approach. Hotel surveillance cameras captured Megan leaving the Holiday Inn Express. Shortly after receiving the call, she walked out of the frame of the security cameras and into oblivion. Her family would never see her alive again. When Megan failed to return home to Maine as scheduled, her brother Greg immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. Megan never went a day without calling her daughter, often speaking with the 3-year-old multiple times throughout the day. The sudden silence was completely out of character and terrifying in its implications. Greg traveled to New York to search for his sister, printing thousands of flyers with her, photograph and distributing them throughout Long Island and Manhattan. He contacted hotels, spoke with other sex workers, and pleaded with police to take the case seriously. But the response from law enforcement was disappointingly familiar. Another sex worker had gone missing. These women were transient by nature, the police suggested. She would probably turn up eventually. The casual dismissal of Megan's disappearance reflected a broader problem in how law enforcement approached cases involving sex workers. These women were often treated as disposable, their lives considered less valuable than those of other crime victims. This institutional bias would allow the Gilgo Beach killer to operate with impunity for years, claiming victim after victim, while police failed to recognize the pattern. By September 2010, the killer was growing more confident and taking greater risks. His next target would be Amber Costello, a 27-year-old woman living in West Babylon, Long Island. Amber had a difficult childhood and had struggled with addiction. Throughout her adult life, sex work was both a symptom of her circumstances and a means of survival in a world that had offered her few alternatives. Amber lived with a roommate who sometimes assisted with her work by posing as a jealous boyfriend. This ruse served two purposes. It allowed Amber to collect payment upfront without providing services, and it gave her an exit strategy if a client seemed dangerous or unpredictable. The arrangement had worked well for months, but it would prove inadequate against the killer, who had been studying the tactics and vulnerabilities of sex workers. On September 1, 2010, a very large man arrived at Amber's house in West Babylon. He was physically imposing, standing approximately 6 feet 4 inches tall with a stocky build and bushy hair. He wore glasses and had an ogre-like appearance that several witnesses would later describe in remarkably consistent terms. The man was driving a dark green Chevrolet Avalanche, a distinctive vehicle that was uncommon enough to stand out in witnesses' memories. The client had arranged to meet Amber at her home, paying the agreed-upon fee upfront, but before any services could be provided, Amber's roommate burst into the room, playing the role of an outraged boyfriend who had discovered his girlfriend with another man. The ruse worked perfectly. The large man seemed startled and embarrassed, quickly gathering his belongings and fleeing the house without demanding his money back. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the end of the encounter. Amber and her roommate had successfully executed their scam, and the client had learned an expensive lesson about the risks of dealing with sex workers. But this client was different. Instead of writing off the loss and finding another provider, he wanted to see Amber again. The next day, September 2nd, the man called Amber's phone. He explained that he was still interested in meeting with her, but this time he wanted to do it away from her house. He had been embarrassed by the encounter with her supposed boyfriend, he said, and preferred to meet somewhere more private. Amber, perhaps feeling guilty about taking his money without providing services, agreed to meet him at a location of his choosing. That evening, a witness saw Amber Costello leave her house and walk toward the street. Moments later, a dark-colored truck was seen driving away from the area where Amber had been walking. She was never seen or heard from again. The witness description of the truck matched the Chevrolet Avalanche that had been parked outside Amber's house the previous day. By this point, 4 women had vanished under remarkably similar circumstances. All were sex workers who advertised online. All had been contacted by burner phones shortly before their disappearances. All had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind families who were desperate for answers and a law enforcement community that seemed reluctant to investigate. The breakthrough in the case would come not from police work, but from the disappearance of a 5th woman, whose case would accidentally lead investigators to the others. Shannan Gilbert was 24 years old when she traveled to Oak Beach, Long Island, on May 1, 2010. Unlike the other victims, Shannan had brought security with her, in the form of a driver who waited outside while she met with clients. Oak Beach was a small, exclusive community on the southern shore of Long Island. It was the kind of place where wealthy New Yorkers built summer homes and where strangers were immediately noticeable. Shannan had arranged to meet a client at one of these expensive homes, but something went terribly wrong during the encounter. At 4:51 a.m. on May 1st, Shannan Gilbert called 911 from inside the client's house. The call lasted 23 minutes and would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the case. Shannan's voice was panicked and desperate as she told the operator that someone was trying to kill her. She couldn't provide her exact location and seemed confused about where she was. The 911 recording captured Shannan's terror. As she pleaded for help, she could be heard telling someone in the room to get away from her, and at one point she screamed that they were trying to kill her. The call ended abruptly, and when police finally arrived at Oak Beach nearly an hour later, Shannan was nowhere to be found. Shannan's disappearance differed from the others in several important ways. She had been with a driver who could provide information about her last known location. She had made a 911 call that created an official record of her distress, and she had vanished from an exclusive community where her presence would have been noticed and remembered. Most importantly, Shannan's mother, Maureen Gilbert, refused to let the police ignore her daughter's case. Maureen was relentless in her advocacy, appearing on television, organizing search parties, and maintaining constant pressure on law enforcement to continue looking for Shannan. Her efforts would ultimately lead to discoveries that no one could have anticipated. 7 months after Shannan's disappearance, police were still conducting searches of the Oak Beach area. On December 11, 2010, a K-9 unit was working along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach when the dog alerted to something in the thick brush beside the road. What the officer found was a human skeleton wrapped in burlap, but it wasn't Shannan Gilbert. The discovery triggered one of the largest crime scene investigations in Long Island history. Over the next 3 days, police found 3 more sets of skeletal remains, all within a quarter-mile of the first discovery. All 4 bodies were young women who had been wrapped in burlap and bound with taper belts. All appeared to have been murdered and dumped in this remote location. The area where the bodies were found was perfect for a serial killer's purposes. Ocean Parkway was a long, straight road that ran through sparsely populated areas of Long Island's South Shore. The brush beside the road was thick enough to conceal bodies, but accessible enough for someone who knew the area well. Most importantly, it was isolated enough that a killer could dump bodies without fear of being observed. DNA analysis and dental records soon revealed the identities of the 4 women. They were Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, the same for women, who had vanished over the previous 3 years. The victims became known as the Gilgo 4, and their discovery finally confirmed what some investigators had begun to suspect. Long Island had a serial killer. The similarities between the 4 cases were impossible to ignore. All the women had advertised on Craigslist. All had been contacted by different burner phones shortly before their disappearances. All had been found wrapped in burlap in the same general area, and analysis of cell phone records revealed that their phones had traveled along similar routes from their last known locations to the area around Massapequa Park, Long Island. The cell phone data provided investigators with their first real break in the case. An FBI analyst was able to create a detailed timeline of the victims' final hours by analyzing which cell towers had received signals from their phones. The pattern was consistent and revealing. The women's phones had traveled from Manhattan or other locations to Massapequa Park, then gone silent forever. Even more importantly, the burner phones used to contact the victims had also pinged towers in Massapequa Park. This suggested that the killer lived or worked in that area and was commuting to Manhattan to find victims. The geographic profile gave investigators a specific area to focus on, dramatically narrowing their search for suspects. Additional evidence supported this theory. Witnesses had described seeing a very large man driving a rare first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. Vehicle registration records showed that relatively few of these trucks existed on Long Island. and even fewer were owned by residents of Massapequa Park. The investigation was finally beginning to focus on a manageable pool of potential suspects. But just as the case was gaining momentum, it became entangled in a web of corruption and incompetence that would delay justice for over a decade. James Burke, who had been appointed as Chief of Department for Suffolk County Police, was more interested in protecting his own criminal activities than solving murders. Burke was a corrupt cop who had spent years engaging in sexual relationships with prostitutes, using his badge to avoid consequences for his behavior. When he was placed in charge of the Gilgo Beach investigation, he made a series of decisions that effectively sabotaged the case. He removed experienced detectives from the investigation, refused to cooperate with federal authorities, and kept the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit from accessing case files. The final blow to the investigation came when Burke became the subject of a federal criminal investigation. He had brutally beaten a suspect who had stolen his duffel bag, which contained sex toys and pornography that Burke used during his encounters with prostitutes. The subsequent cover-up consumed the attention of Suffolk County's top law enforcement officials for years, leaving the Gilgo Beach case to gather dust in filing cabinets. Burke was eventually arrested and sentenced to prison, but the damage to the investigation was irreversible. By the time honest cops took over the case, years had passed and crucial evidence had been lost or compromised. The killer had continued operating during this period, potentially claiming additional victims, while law enforcement was distracted by corruption scandals. It wasn't until 2022 that a new task force was formed to take a fresh look at the Gilgo Beach murders. This team included investigators from multiple agencies who were committed to solving the case regardless of where the evidence led. They began by reviewing all the existing evidence with modern analytical tools and techniques. The task force quickly realized that earlier investigators had actually collected most of the evidence needed to identify the killer. The witness descriptions, the vehicle information, the cell phone data, and the geographic profile all pointed to a specific type of suspect living in a specific area. What had been missing was the systematic analysis needed to connect these pieces of evidence. Using modern database searches, investigators looked for men who met the physical description, lived in Massapequa Park, worked in Manhattan, and owned first-generation Chevrolet Avalanches. The search returned a remarkably short list of names, with one standing out above all others: Rex Heuermann. Rex Andrew Heuermann was 59 years old, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed over 300 pounds. He lived in the same house in Massapequa Park where he had grown up, and he worked as an architectural consultant with an office in Midtown Manhattan. Most importantly, he owned a green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche that matched witness descriptions exactly. Heuermann's background seemed to fit the profile investigators had developed. He was a married father of 2 who appeared to live a normal suburban life. He had no criminal record and no history of violence that anyone knew about. But beneath this facade of normalcy, investigators suspected lay the mind of a serial killer who had been operating undetected for over a decade. The task force began conducting surveillance on Heuermann, monitoring his movements and activities while they built their case. They needed DNA evidence to definitively link him to the murders, but obtaining such evidence without alerting him to their suspicions required careful planning and patience. For months, investigators followed Heuermann and searched through his garbage, hoping to find discarded items that might contain his DNA. They watched him at his home in Massapequa Park and at his office in Manhattan, documenting his routines and habits. But despite their efforts, they were unable to obtain the genetic evidence they needed. The breakthrough finally came in January 2023, when surveillance officers observed Heuermann discarding a pizza box outside his Manhattan office. Working quickly, they retrieved the box and discovered that it contained an uneaten pizza, crust with traces of Heuermann's saliva. The DNA profile extracted from this evidence was then compared to genetic material that had been recovered from the crime scenes over a decade earlier. The comparison was conclusive. DNA from Rex Heuermann's saliva matched genetic material found on the burlap wrapping that had been used to conceal Megan Waterman's body. After more than 13 years, Investigators finally had the evidence they needed to arrest the Gilgo Beach killer. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was walking from his Manhattan office to catch a train home when he was surrounded by law enforcement officers. He was arrested without incident and charged with the murders of Megan Waterman, Melissa Bartholomew, and Amber Costello. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community and brought a sense of relief to families who had waited over a decade for justice. The investigation into Heuermann's activities revealed disturbing details about his secret life. Analysis of his internet search history showed over 100 searches related to the Gilgo Beach murders, indicating that he had been closely following media coverage of the case and police investigations. He had also conducted extensive searches for violent pornography, including content depicting the torture and murder of women. Even more troubling, Heuermann had searched for information about the victims' family members, including their children and siblings. This suggested that his psychological torture of families was not limited to the taunting phone calls made to Melissa Bartholomew's sister. He had been watching and studying the people left behind by his crimes, perhaps considering them as potential future targets. A 12-day search of Heuermann's home revealed additional evidence of his violent proclivities. Investigators found a concrete-lined vault in his basement containing over 280 weapons, including rifles, handguns, and various other firearms. The house itself was described as cluttered and disorganized, suggesting that Heuermann was a hoarder who had difficulty discarding possessions. Rex Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to all charges and maintains his innocence. His defense attorneys argue that the evidence against him is circumstantial and that DNA contamination could explain the genetic matches. However, prosecutors are confident that they have built a strong case that will result in conviction. The arrest has also reopened questions about other unsolved murders that might be connected to Heuermann. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states are reviewing cold cases involving the murders of sex workers, looking for similar patterns or evidence that might link these crimes to the Gilgo Beach killer. Meanwhile, the families of the victims are finally beginning to see justice for their loved ones. Greg Waterman, Megan's brother, has spoken about the relief of finally knowing who killed his sister. Even as he continues to grieve her loss, the other families have expressed similar feelings, grateful that their years of advocacy and searching have finally produced results. The case has also highlighted the ongoing vulnerabilities faced by sex workers and the need for law enforcement to take crimes against these women seriously. The victims were not disposable people living on society's margins. They were daughters, mothers, and sisters who were trying to survive in difficult circumstances. Their deaths represent not just individual tragedies, but systemic failures that allowed a predator to operate with impunity for over a decade. As Rex Heuermann awaits trial, questions remain about the full extent of his crimes. Was he responsible for other murders that have not yet been connected to him? Are there additional victims whose bodies have not been discovered? And what about Shannan Gilbert, whose disappearance started the investigation that ultimately led to his arrest? Shannan's death remains officially classified as an accidental drowning, but many investigators and family members believe she was actually Heuermann's first victim. Her 911 call from Oak Beach and subsequent disappearance bear similarities to the other cases, and her death occurred during the same time period when Heuermann was actively hunting victims. Whether Shannan Gilbert was murdered or died by accident may never be definitively determined, but her legacy is clear. Without her disappearance and her mother's tireless advocacy, the Gilgo Beach killer might still be operating today. Shannan's final act was to lead investigators to the other victims and finally bring their killer to justice. The Gilgo Beach murders represent one of the most significant serial killer cases in recent American history. The investigation revealed both the potential of modern forensic techniques and the devastating impact of police corruption on criminal justice. Most importantly, it demonstrated that every victim deserves justice, regardless of their circumstances or the prejudices they may face. Rex Heuermann's trial is expected to begin in 2024, and it will likely provide additional details about his methods and motivations. For the families of his victims, The trial represents the culmination of years of pain, frustration, and advocacy. For law enforcement, it represents a chance to finally close one of Long Island's most notorious cold cases. The beaches of Long Island will never be the same. What was once known as a beautiful stretch of coastline is now forever associated with one man's reign of terror. But in the end, justice has prevailed. The Gilgo Beach killer has been caught, and the voices of his victims will finally be heard in a court of law.